and I'm lucky to be joined by one of my recently former colleagues at Franklin and Marshall, Hannah Kim. You want to give yourself a brief introduction, please?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Hannah Kim. I'm actually the director of international recruitment and admission at Franklin and Marshall College. I'm going into my fifth year with the college this year. But for the past couple of years, I've actually been helping to oversee our CBE process and our review process for both our domestic and our international applications.
Okay, great. Yeah, and she and I have read probably a handful of thousands of applications, especially on the international side, because F&M had a huge influx of those over the last few years, and I had a territory in which we didn't have a whole lot of folks, so I was always done before everyone else, so I had to kind of find something to do, and there was always international apps to be read. So how tonight's going to go is it's kind of a unique kind of twist on the case studies program. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are with this program. It's typically offered at a specific school in which sample applications are created and the students, and sometimes it's divided between students in one room and families in a parents in another room, and they act as mock admission officers. So they have access to sample applications, a college profile, and then essentially they're broken down into rooms and they read the applications and they figure out, okay, where does this person stand in line with the fictitious college's admissibility standard? Typically, the exercise requires you to make a one admission, one wait list, and one denial. And Hannah and I can kind of tell you firsthand that's not how it actually goes, but we understand why it's used for illustrative purposes. So what I decided to do instead is create my own applications, and she and I will go through what's called committee-based evaluation, or CBE for short. We'll go over that in just a little while, and you can see in real time how we actually review the applications. We'll kind of go back and forth there and then leave some time for Q&As and also what you would have done with the three applications that was sent to you, should have been sent to you earlier today or yesterday. So we'll go ahead and get this thing started with holistic admissions and application review. Don't need to worry about me because hopefully most of you know who I am. I've been in the college side. New to the IEC world, been involved in NACAC, the Texas affiliate TACAC, as well as IECA. So holistic admissions, what is it? It's one of those phrases, like I mentioned earlier, that's on the tip of everyone's tongue when you're talking about admission, right? If you go to any college fair, high school visit, and you ask these officers, how do you review applications? A lot of them will use that term, and the schools that might use it may surprise you just from the sheer size of them. So it can be a huge flagship that gets 100,000 applications, or I came from a small liberal arts college that on a good year would get 10,000 applications, right? So essentially, holistic admission refers to looking at the whole picture as opposed to one or two. So you don't have a series of applications, and here's the GPA, test scores, and then if they're above, we're good to go. If they're below, see you later. It's not that simple. We look at academics, writing, extracurricular involvement, personal characteristics, leadership, writing, all those things, and using it to create a more complete picture than just reducing these students that spend a lot of time on the applications, and the counselors, you spend a lot of time with them on the applications, not to reduce them to one or two quantitative factors. Another hallmark of this process is the genuine importance of both academic and social context. So, what do we actually mean by that? So, the classic example I use is there is a student that's a clear arts humanities kid. They're taking all the AP histories, the Englishes, and they have a B minus or a C in biology, right? So, on the one hand, you kind of shudder, oh no, that's a bad grade. But then if you realize everything they're doing is building up to wanting to major and then be involved in the arts or the humanities or social sciences, that weak STEM grade isn't going to be viewed. If they use holistic admissions as negatively as, oh, just looking at the transcript as is, right? And additionally, there are other hooks we can all talk about, geographic hooks. For athletics, that can be something to consider as well. So it just kind of shows you there's a wide variety of these factors to go into this process. So now thinking about application review. There are two main kind of schools of thought here for application review. When I was at F&M, I actually did both of these. When I first started at the college, we had the traditional first and second reader, right? So you have one person read the entire application, making their comments, recommendations, then they send it off to a designated second person who then reviews the application, kind of does some minor proofreading, make sure they didn't add an extra or any typos on the course rigor determination, things like that. Then they offer their own recommendations. Then it goes into a specific bin. And as you might imagine, with these huge applicant pools, that can take a lot of time, right? So, and the more popular option a lot of schools have been going for is committee-based or called paired reading. Essentially, you're splitting the application in two, and both people are reading the application simultaneously. And then you have a brief discussion, and then you decide between the two of you which bin that might go to, whether it's an admit, a deny, waitlist, or the always interesting committee bin. We can kind of talk about that a little bit later. So just something to keep in mind, how are these applications actually read? Here is a relatively not too out of date territory map from F&M, in which you can literally see here's the state in which they're being read. There'll be geographic area, depending on the primary application markets of a school. Like for F&M, for example, we didn't have one person cover New Jersey, right? That would be a Herculean effort. We had folks that were dividing up in maybe North Jersey or South Jersey or Princeton area. Same with Pennsylvania too. So it can be by school location, not where the student's actually from, because we know there are a lot of boarding schools out there. So say there is someone from Austin who is boarding at Phillips Exeter, the person who covers New England will review the application as opposed to myself in that hypothetical situation. Additionally, they might review by your college or major, and then a specific student type, so transfers and then things like that. So CBE is kind of the more in vogue model a lot of these schools are offering. It was created by UPenn several years ago, and it's typically used by the universities that have big applicant pools. They don't have a battalion of people to read them, right? Because it's all about efficiency. I don't want to use the word speed, but it's more of a quicker process than that traditional first and second read. Typically, each application takes 5 to 10 minutes to read. There are certain exceptions to that rule, but in preparation for this session, I contacted folks that I know from various colleges, and of, I think, the 20 folks I talked to, one of them mentioned they took longer than 15 minutes for each application. So that kind of shows you it's a very rapid, specific process as opposed to kind of dwelling on the minute details that you might think goes into this process. The main pro, I think, from this is allows everybody to learn more about schools outside their territories. So going back to my background, for example, I know the Texas public schools, I know the South, I know all kind of those that area. But when I read with Hannah, I would have literally applications from countries I've heard of, but I had no idea on the school type because even within a country, there are very different curriculum standards across the board, right? You might have an international or American school, you might have a British school, you might have a national curriculum. And those are very different schools. And so when I would review these, I got a kind of a crash course in terms of, okay, here's what a minus student looks like at a American school in Vietnam versus a national curriculum in Mongolia or Ghana, right? So it gives you a lot to initially chew on, which is great practice for especially the the newer members of the staff and that are not used to this process at all. But then the main drawback, as you might imagine, is you're only as fast as your slowest reader. And so that's why Handy can kind of share with us personally what goes into selecting those reading pairs and how that maybe shifts not only throughout the week, but even from day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying that at F&M and I think at most schools, we go through an annual reader training process. Obviously as new staff come in, but even just as a refresher to kind of get us back in the mentality of we are now in reading season. So that typically for most schools takes place, I'd say sometime around November. And so that should just get everyone together to start thinking about, if we want to make any changes, if any changes kind of reviewing from the last cycle are going to be implemented for the upcoming cycle. And then, like I said, just get back into the mentality as people get off the road and are no longer traveling and recruiting to start thinking about, actually sitting down and reviewing these applications. So reader training is something that takes place over a couple of days for us, and it's very intensive, and it's just a time for all of our staff to be together. And then as we then start actually going through training, I'd seen colleges do this in several different ways. Some people will read like all 5 days of the week, for example. Some people will take like a single day off. For us, it's like every Wednesday we have meetings, so we don't read on Wednesdays. But no matter what, again, that is like the primary thing that we are doing at this point in the year. And so when we talk about reading CBE, pairings change constantly. So we try to keep an eye on whose applications are coming in and whose queues are getting larger. So the way that we separate applications, and Matt's kind of alluded to this, is that the kind of primary reader in the pair is the territory manager for that school that the student is applying from. And so if I'm reading like the transcripts, for example, from that, I can still be paired with someone else who's outside of my territory. But obviously, we need to keep an eye on who has the most applications coming in. So we'll usually do it like 1 or 2 weeks in advance, but every single day over that course of that week, I might be paired with a different person. So like Matt said, not only reading different countries, for example, but obviously within the United States, there's a lot of variation when it comes to curriculums, when it comes to schools, when it comes to the way transcripts look. And so everyone gets a little bit of exposure to a little bit of everything. The other thing I can say as, one of the people who helps schedule and do the pairings is you start to get a sense of kind of what people's strengths and weaknesses are. Matt put you're only as fast as your slowest reader. I would definitely say that's true. And so, some of us might just naturally read faster. We have some former college counselors on the high school side who work in our admissions office, for example. And so we know that they give a lot of very understandable like dedication to making sure that they read every word in detail as slowly as possible of the college, the counselor letters of recommendation, because they've been in those shoes and they know how much work and effort goes into that. And so just knowing that kind of background, I'm more inclined to know to pair that person with someone else who I think will be a good match when reviewing certain types of applications. So it's very intentional, but there is like a lot of thought process that goes into, how we review the pairs and then the kind of exposure that you get to lots of different types of curriculums and types of readers throughout the process.
Yes, we kind of just mentioned how we split into halves. It's going to be generally your academic versus personal, is what how Hannah mentioned, the primary reader. It makes sense for them to read the academic stuff, right? Because they've been to the high schools. They hopefully should know the school profile pretty well. They should know what a transcript looks like in a South Jersey public school versus a Metro Boston independent school. It might have some wacky scales here and there. So that allows the process to run even more smoothly because they have firsthand knowledge that they can then share and say, okay, for example, a student might have a low GPA, but this school's GPA kind of distribution chart is skewed downward compared to other schools, right? So that's what it really takes into account knowing your territory, knowing their territories, knowing the schools, and you can have that conversation in real time as well. So before we kind of dive into the actual demonstration, I just want to mention a couple of different, I guess, materials that's part of this process, but not directly part of what we're doing tonight. So the first thing to consider is what's known as the reader form. So if you can kind of visualize this with me, you have an application pulled up when you're reviewing. There are two columns. There is a left-hand column and then the right-hand column. The left-hand column is going to have the materials by different type, right? So you have, okay, here's a dashboard, here's the transcript, here's the essay, here's the letters of recommendation, any additional information. That's all on the left side that you have access to, while on the right side is where you actually fill in the information. And hopefully, if the person that submitted the application did their due diligence, a lot of that data auto-populates already into the reader form, whether it's a GPA or how many APs are offered at that school or honors. That comes from the high school profile. Well, things like that. A lot of that quantitative information automatically comes through, so we don't have to manually look at every single thing and count them. Sometimes you do, but oftentimes that's already taken care of us too. Series of drop-down menus and short answer style text boxes. So thinking about what is the unweighted GPA, it kind of has the drop-downs there. Evaluation of course rigor, it can say most demanding, somewhat, maybe I think I had this right, somewhat demanding, demanding, not demanding. It goes pretty comprehensive. It's kind of your classic kind of survey, like 5 or 6 point model, right? Of 1 to 5, are you satisfied or not satisfied? And then short answer style text boxes, that kind of goes with the comments that you provide in addition to those those numbers, right? So for example, you can kind of summarize, oh, about an essay was saying, oh, average essay, good content, uh, mediocre style, something like that, that you can write out as opposed to just checking a box or two. Then once you're done, you send that off to the appropriate bin. And that's after you and your partner have made that initial discussion there. I guess, Hannah, do you want to talk about even before they open up an application, what does that kind of that home screen look like to kind of see, oh, here's how many applications we have in our, you mentioned queues earlier. Maybe kind of go into what that looks like on the initial on their end.
Where you can just see the list of everyone in your queue, basically.
Yeah.
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 So your queue, like I said, is everyone who has a completed application in your given territory, and it has some just basic information. And you can kind of decide based on that basic information how you're going to prioritize the applications you're going to read. And so, for example, not only will it have the student's name, but it'll obviously have the high school name. It'll have what we call the geo market. So geo markets are separated by regions around the country or different countries around the world. So when you're, and it'll also have, for some people, it'll have like financial aid information. It'll have an academic rating or information based on that after the review. So there's different ways that people can prioritize how they read. Maybe they'll read all the applications from one school all at the same time, for example. So you can see the benefit to doing something like that. Or maybe they'll read all from the same region of the state at the same
Mhm.
time. So there's different ways, just looking at that kind of initial dashboard, that you can prioritize your applications. One thing we try to do is, as a need aware institution, is prioritize those with completed financial aid versus those who don't have completed financial aid, which is why we encourage people to get their financial aid documents in as soon as possible as well.
Yeah. And then you mentioned dashboard, but there's actually another dashboard to talk about when you actually open it, the application. And just think of this as kind of your home page, right? So you'll have a lot of the like a snapshot of basic information, the student's name, application round, geo markets, high schools, If they're an athlete, there might be a sport tag. If they've done a pre-read, there would be pre-read comments. There would be also at the bottom if they visited campus, things like that. So what to keep in mind is after all these initial decisions have been made and they haven't been sent out yet to the students during committee, this is oftentimes how we start reading a applicant that's already been reviewed. We kind of go to the dashboard and then we'll go to the cluster report, which I'll talk about in just a minute. That's the initial kind of point of reference that you use to kick off the discussion when you're talking about individual applicant. And speak of this, cluster report. So if you have done admission case studies report, have you probably don't know what this actually is because it's something exclusively from the college. So I've included this materials on as part of our sample materials, and this is another primary document that's used during the admission committee and during the shaping process. So it breaks down all the applicants from one specific high school that's applied to your school. And an easily readable chart. It'll show the application round, decision, and academic rating, which is basically all the stuff you fill out on the reader form. It generates a number. And then the financial aid rating is based on the financial aid documents that are filled out by the applicant. It's -1 all the way to 10. -1 means you're not applying for aid. 10 means it's a full need student. So that's all in that one. It's like an Excel spreadsheet pretty much. And it's a great way to give additional context, especially if there are how do I put this? A wide variety of applicants from that school at one given time, across the spectrum of, oh, here's a slam dunk applicant. This one isn't competitive at all. This one's kind of in the middle. You can refer back to, okay, here's what we did 2 years ago with this class, or here's what we did in ED in years before. Here's what we did in RD. So it's another way in which you can add context when discussing the applications. And then in terms of committee, this can either be virtual or in person. Since we were a team of both regionally based and on campus, we had to be virtual we didn't want to fly our person from California and just kind of camp out for a few days. So it was done via Zoom. And this is a way to have everyone in the room and you discuss those applications. And the territory manager, that's their time to execute an elevator pitch for the applicant. Some committees might review all applications together, or the ones maybe just in committee bin, or some suspect ones that could either be pulled out of an admit bin or bring out from a deny bin to admit. So that's part of shaping too. While all this is going on, you have data folks, operation folks running models to figure out where they are in the class, right? So after that first, actually every year, after the second day of committee, after we did that first full day, I would say every year that I was there, we were over budget kind of forecast. And that's just how it is, right? You admit a lot of the great kids you want, but just sometimes the budget financial aid allocation doesn't match up. And then that's where the shaping comes in when you look at, okay, who can we pull into the class? Who can we pull out of the class? It's just another extension of a multi-stage review process, right? They're not just being reviewed twice, and that's it. It's a conscious effort to really look at everything and see what might have been falling through the cracks. So that's something to keep in mind too. While all this is going on, you have folks that aren't in the room with admission folks looking at these events unfolding in real time, I guess. Okay. Go ahead and stop here. If there's any questions so far. Oh, comments being audited later. Oh, so I guess are you referring to if they write something untoward yeah. To be honest, I guess Hannah, you can kind of talk about the training, but we've given specific instructions to be respectful and not write things that may be misconstrued. So Hannah, you might want to maybe elaborate on that.
Yeah, I don't know about the likelihood of that happening, but we always say that we would never write something when reviewing an application that we would not want or we would be embarrassed to have someone else read later. So like Matt said, it's very important to us that we're respectful. It is Oh, that's a good question too about seasonal readers. But yeah, it is definitely something where like we want to be respectful and we are not sitting there like as the judgment police saying all these reasons why we're not admitting a student. If anything, we're doing more positives so that the way we use those comments later are, for example, in the committee that Matt was talking about, when you like present on your student and you need another pair of eyes on it and talk about like why you pushed it forward to that committee stage. That's more of how our comments are used. So it's not meant to be like judgments or anything we would not want someone to see.
And then kind of going off on that, when we talked about the admissions committee itself, like how it goes about making the decisions, right? So we have the initial decision made by the CBE pair, and then it's in a current bin. So after we have the elevator pitch, the dean is usually the one that kind of runs the show. They oversee everything. They're I guess they're kind of like the vice president in Congress, and they when they cast a tie breaking vote, more or less. So what happens is, for the virtual ones, we usually have a Zoom poll, in which I wish I could have put that on this, but I didn't know how to do that. But that's just another conversation for another day. In which you have just admit, deny, waitlist, and then you make your selection, and then it's kind of broadcast to the group, and then whatever the results are, that's where it goes, and of course can always change based upon other factors down the road. That's your initial kind of conversation. Before we did this CB model, we did the classic first and second person, and everything was in person. We reviewed every application. As you might imagine, it took a whole lot of time to do so. And literally, we would have the entire admission kind of travel team in a big kind of not classroom, but maybe a boardroom style setting. And we would literally put our thumbs up or thumbs down for admit or deny. To be honest, I wasn't a fan of that method, but when it was in person, we had that method. It just shows that everyone has their equal say in what can happen potentially. So that's another way in which it's not just at the behest of a territory manager or even the person they read with. It goes through the whole group. One final thing before we kind of go to our demonstration, I wanted to add a slide about landscape, but unfortunately, that is no more. And I don't want to say anything that's being recorded that could be more anger on my part, but I'll just tell you it was a very valuable tool used by savvy admission folks to give additional context, especially in terms of test optional applicants that decided to submit scores that were below our school's profile. So Hannah, you know this firsthand. Whenever we had a person present and they might have skipped it, whether it's they forgot about it or knew, I would kind of wait a few seconds and kind of pipe in saying, "Oh, this person's SAT was 100 points above the 75th percentile." It's what that allowed the conversation to do is change from, is this person hitting our agreed upon numbers to, can this student actually do well here? Now you got rid of that tool, unfortunately. It's harder to make that jump, but like I said, that's a conversation for another day. Hannah, do you want to add anything before we go into our demonstration?
Think there was one other thing I was going to say about the benefit. Oh, so CBE in general, I'll just add really quickly. One of the other benefits that I think I've seen from CBE is that, you know, in the old days of reading applications, it was not uncommon to feel a significant amount of burnout amongst the readers. With a first read, second read, when you're reading every application in its entirety, you might be reading into the evenings. You might be reading, you know, frequently on weekends. And one thing that CBE provides is it alleviates a little bit of that burnout so that we're giving an equal and fair amount of attention to each application. So that is definitely something that I definitely prefer a CBE format for that reason as well. But other than that, I think I'm ready to go in.
Okay, so hopefully you received the materials I sent out either today or yesterday, depending on when you registered. So what we're gonna do is Hannah and I are actually gonna read the three sample applications as if we were a CBE pair and assuming that we've been doing this for a while as opposed to just dusting this off for the first time in a year or so for me and then a little bit less for you. So if you want to, please follow along. I'll have it on the screen here, but hopefully you might have those materials in front of us. And so the best way to start with this is to go through the college profile, right? So I'll pull that up real quick. Yeah, so this is, like I said, I created all this from scratch. So any, I guess any similarities are purely coincidental, whatever the tagline they use for books for being fiction or not, just assume that's the case. I kind of thought about this and hopefully this kind of shows you how we go through this process. So Thornton University, New England, 2,800 undergraduates, so 700 each year. D3 athletic except for ice hockey, which is not uncommon for that part of the country. Students come from a wide variety of states and countries, as you might imagine, Northeast and California, because it's California and there's a bunch of folks out there. In terms of the admissions profile, 4,500 out of 12,000, and then 700 enrolled out of the 4,500 admitted. So it kind of shows you right off the bat that it's highly selective, but yield can be an issue. Just looking at the numbers between admitted and enrolled. Middle 50%, 1,300 to 1,420, 20 to 32, but test optional. And as you can see, 60% of those admitted students submitted a test score. So 40% did not. So pretty much in line with the overall admissibility percentage, give or take. Don't have an average GPA because there are a wide variety of school curriculums and weighting policies. Rather, we look at the rigor of the core course load, and we'll kind of show you how we determine that during the demonstration. Doesn't admit my major. It's everyone's applying just to the just to the school, right? 2 rounds of ED, 1 round of EA, and then 1 round of RD. Meets full demonstrated need for all applicants, but is need aware. And then the majority of students receive need-based aid and merit scholarships range between 10,000 to 40,000 per year. So now you kind of have these initial details in mind. So we'll go ahead and start with our first student. So let me pull up. Since I'll be the primary reader, even though I don't have these territories hypothetically, I'll be handling the academics and then Hannah will kind of do the more personal details. So I'll pull that up right here. So you can see Blake has, we'll say, an A- student. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's say 8 or 9 honors courses, 4, 5 APs, so strong rigor. There is no issues with downward grade trend or downward rigor. So going back up here, and then I'll just go to the profile real quick. Hannah, that he can take it away. Looking at the school profile that he goes to, independent co-ed pre-K in LA, 100 graduating seniors does not calculate rank or GPA. Average SAT is 1250, average ACT is 26. 15 APs offered, typically capped at 2 and 10, 3 to 4, 11th and 12th. So right there, he's taken a lot of good rigor based on what's offered at his school. 55% of students have taken at least 3 APs, so he's right in that wheelhouse there. And then, okay. And Hannah, you want to go through the application?
Sure. So right off the bat, we have some information about like what mom and dad do, for example. So even if I didn't see financial aid, that might be able to give me a little bit of an idea of what their financial aid was going to look like, whether it was completed or not. Also, the number of siblings in college for some schools, depending on like if they are a CSS profile school, for example, that could also play a part into it. But I can see the uh, senior year courses that they're taking. So obviously taking some current AP courses as well as physics honors, statistics, all that stuff is not going to play into necessarily the academics, but it does help me see in terms of trend if they're continuing to take rigorous courses. So that's definitely helpful. This school does not admit people by major, but it's still helpful to see what they're interested in. So interest in economics and psychology as well. And then activities is kind of the main thing that I would be looking at in the application here. The first thing I noticed right away, it's very well-rounded. So there's a little bit of mix of things. There's, some athletics, but there's also some theater and then some volunteer work. And then there's definitely some leadership as well. So leadership at a liberal arts school is definitely a big thing that I would pay attention to. And there's a number of different leadership roles here from like captain, vice president of National Honor Society, and then the athletics leadership committee initiative that they started. Um, Going on, obviously, engagement would be something. So, in Matt's fictional profile, he didn't say specifically if this is the type of school that preferences demonstrated interest. Some schools do, like they prioritize it, especially depending on rounds. Some schools don't care, but even if they don't like prioritize it as something that's like essential for like regular decision applicants, for example, it would still be something that I would definitely notice.
Assume they
Um,
do. That's all I
Assume
tell
they,
folks. Even
there
if
you
they
go.
say
Yeah.
no, just assume they do.
Works for me.
Yeah.
So definitely there's some good engagement here, interviews, things like that. A number of different ways that they've engaged both on campus, but also like at a college fair, for example, and then periodic emails.
Okay. And then now I do the letter recommendation, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So yeah, basically it kind of speaks to him as an applicant, strong rigor in the taking the courses that matter to him, but also being knowledgeable enough to not overexert himself with his weaknesses, specifically maybe STEM courses going the honors route instead of the AP. Mentions the athletics that was already in the application. Also looked at commitment to helping others, so there's some soft skills right there. And then there's a superlative. We'll kind of break it down to, I'd say superlative. It's in terms of the content. It's you can tell that he is could be a valuable asset to campus in a variety of ways. And then now the application essay.
Yeah, so for the essay, I would say I feel like an essay is it does its job if I feel like I've learned something about the student walking away from it, right? I feel like that's the case here. So in terms of content, I'd probably say, outstanding or something along those lines. Because I feel like I've not only taken a piece of his application, like activities, but he's taken it a step farther and talked about like how it's impacted him and how it can apply to his future as well. It definitely speaks to a liberal arts mentality as well, especially towards the end where he talks about how he has an interest in the performing arts, despite the fact that we just saw economics and psychology are his intended majors. So I would definitely come out of this essay feeling like I've learned about him as a person. He's a well-rounded individual that would do well at a liberal arts school where he has the flexibility to explore multiple things.
Okay, last thing is looking at this cluster report in which he is the only applicant right now. He's applying early action. His SAT is below Thornton's profile, but it's the average for the high school. Academic rating that, like I said, it's an algorithm determined by the rigor, grades, all that. It's a 7, so pretty good. Financial aid rating a 1, which means he is low need. Visited campus. So looking at this, you can see, okay, I've highlighted the ones in red that were denied and then add the yellows that were waitlisted. and his profile is better than all of those, right? Yeah. So that's kind of how we look at the cluster report, at least initially for Blake. So that's to keep in mind, most of the stuff is being done silently, but I can't really do that on a webinar in which you're sitting there, right? So typically we're reviewing everything at the same time. So all this is done in a matter of minutes, in which then we will have a brief conversation. So, okay, here's what we got, here's where we think they should go. But just for the matter for this exercise, we're going to kind of show you how we would go about reviewing it there.
Can I make another quick point about the cluster report as well?
Yeah.
Especially for those who are seeing a cluster report for the first time. I think when we talk about holistic admissions, there can be a tendency to think, well, isn't this kind of the opposite of that? We're boiling everything down to just like their academics, their financial aid rating, et cetera, and then looking at them in a school. But the way that I think a cluster report can be helpful in a holistic admissions process isn't just as like a guideline of like, we're not just like waitlist, deny,
Yeah.
admit one student each. But what it can do is when we do counselor calls with you guys, it helps prepare us for the conversations that we know we're more likely to have. And so the cluster report kind of guides us towards this is a student we know will be brought up in those counselor calls. And so we can prepare in advance to make sure that we have the justification prepared to kind of talk to you guys and explain how we got to the decision that we did. Because just because we admitted a student previously with the same academic rating and the same financial aid rating does not mean we're going to automatically admit that same
Yeah.
student this year as well. So I just want to make that little caveat
Yeah.
about
It's basically kind of like a check on what you've done in the past, right? It's not going to be your guiding light, but it helps you get everything quickly and make sure you didn't screw up when your initial assessment, right? Oh, this person looking back now is the best applicant they've seen. Why do we put them in a deny bin? It's more like that than anything else, too. So now going into our second applicant, Jillian. Do this. So weaker GPA than the first person we talked to, but like hypothetically speaking, this is a completely different application. We don't know anything about Blake the first time, but it just kind of shows you this. There, say a B plus maybe, downward trend in grades in 11th, but the grades themselves, C pluses are in math and science, but the humanities courses are doing just fine. So that's that classic example of context when looking at course rigor. So a lot of honors courses, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, give or take, and then five APs. So another pretty good rigor there. Now going to the school profile. She goes to a public school in Massachusetts. As you can see, average SAT 1090, average ACT 21. Rank is calculated by decile, not exact. 8 APs and 12 honors offered. We saw five out of eight, that's pretty good. And then a lot of those honors too. So I would almost put that at either the highest demanding rigor or just below. So now go in the application.
So, intended major is government political science here, and that definitely is in line with the activities. So, 4 years of student council, good commitment there. Commitment is another thing we haven't really talked about, but when we talk about activities, commitment is something that we like to see. So, we'd rather see someone committed to a few activities than have a whole list of activities that they've only done for a couple months or a year, et cetera. So good commitment there. The internship with the representative as well, that obviously is in line with what their interests are. And then Spanish club and also care for younger siblings after school too. And then similar to the last applicant, we do have some engagement here, campus tour. They've been on campus, they've visited, they've also done an interview, and they've also engaged with us through like a college fair visit.
Yeah, a very huge college fair. So that's nothing to
Mhm.
consider too, is they didn't have that intimate, oh, here's 40 schools for an hour and a half. Boston, NACAC is probably going to be in an arena amphitheater in which if you
Mhm.
don't have a game plan, you're really not going to see a whole lot of schools. So this shows deliberate thought on her part. Two, letter recommendation. Typically, it might be one and one, so one from the counselor, one from the teacher. It just depends on the school. I wanted to give a teacher recommendation letter, for example. It's her AP US Gov, and then previously a push teacher. Strong recommendation tells us that she does well and she has a conscientious streak in her, and she'd be a good fit for those colleges that value that in applicants. So strong recommendation letter there.
So the essay is about her time working with the representative, Martina's office. So I would definitely read this application and see passion all over the place. So I really like in applications when different parts of the materials reinforce other parts. So her activities reinforce her letters of recommendation, which reinforce her essay. And so passion is definitely something that I would say is relevant here. In terms of writing quality, I'd probably say good, it's fine. I don't necessarily feel like I learned that much more about her other than what we'd already seen on the application, but definitely, like I said, passion for what she has expressed interest in.
Okay, another cluster report. It's quite different than the first one we saw, in the fact that there are only 5 applicants that have applied to the school, period, even though they're just one state away, right? We remember looking at the high school profile in which, by and large, everyone went to UMass or Boston. They never didn't really venture out unless it was for art, so RISD and Providence. So you can see here, academic rating is a little bit is lower because largely due to the grades and the downward trend grade wise. But SAT is not only above Thornton's profile, but it's well above her high school. Mid need for financial aid and visited campus too. So you can kind of see academically she's just looking at the rating itself, it's might be a little bit underwhelming, but then looking at the test scores, second highest in the cluster report, and the one that got higher was a no need student, 1470 went to BC. So academically, she's very competitive compared to the applications we had got previously. The one that had the higher academic rating and lower financial aid rating, uh, we use the term unrealized, in which that's when you have someone who was admitted and decided to go elsewhere and they let us know, right? You might see unconditional, in which you never know. So the worst thing you get as an admissions officer is thousands of admit unconditionals, because one, you don't know what they're doing, and two, you actually don't know where they got in, so you can't see who's our accurate kind of peer schools too. So that's just kind of some lingo that we have there. And then the last one is Travis. Okay, we'll say, yeah, B minus and below. That's the lowest. That's typically the lowest drop down on the unweighted GPA, but there is a positive grade trend each year. He had a rough first year, but is mostly a B student since. We don't have any grades so far, but there is some positive that it's an upward trend there. And then let me see real quick. Going to the school profile, we saw there was little rigor, and this is a South Florida Catholic all-male school, so there's a lot of inherent rigor offered, APs and honors. Most students take at least one AP, and 25% take at least four. So there are kids at that school that do the work, and he's just not there in terms of rigor just yet. School doesn't calculate rank, that's why we just have the GPA. But if you look at the bottom here, one of the most popular colleges admitted is, for some reason, the school that we worked for, right? You'd think, oh, Fort Lauderdale to New Hampshire is not a common kind of pathway, but the proof is in the pudding, that you see that, oh, there are folks that matriculate from this high school to our school.
Yeah, so right off the bat, you can see at the top here, dad is independent financial consultant and mom is CFO of Carnival Cruise Lines. So some of the information that we are looking for through the application, and this would be a good example of it, isn't just for our review to determine admissibility, but it's also to determine if we need to let other campus partners know information if they were to be admitted and enroll. So that could be student affairs, that could be academic affairs, that could be advancement, which is what it would be in this case. So sometimes we're selecting that type of information. We even have a button that says, like, I think this would be a good future tour guide at our school, something like that. So sometimes we're not just looking at admissibility, but we're thinking about if they were to enroll here, what type of information would be helpful or relevant for various campus partners. We do have business as the major of interest. We have 2 years as the future business leaders of America, so clearly a passion for that. Beyond that, it looks like football is the main activity here. It seems like that's what he spends most of his time doing. Team captain, 3-time all conference, and has been a part of it all 4 years of high school. We do also have some engagement. And then from an athletic perspective, it does say that they've met with the football coach. They're not actively being recruited, but would be on the team if admitted. That's just probably something that I would make note of as well. I think if the
And
coach was,
you love to get that message for the
yeah,
kids that aren't slam dunk
if
academically, right?
if the coach was really passionate about it, coaches are not afraid to let people know. That's what I would say there. So definitely, and there's even a note there. Parents have been flagged by the advancement office as potential large donor as well. And then I would also make a note about potential switch to ED2 if not admitted to ED1 as well.
Yeah. And then hypothetically, if I was the athletics liaison at this school, I would follow up with the coach because I see someone who is playing all conference level in South Florida private schools. He can play D3 football, even if it's at a bench player. So that would be something I would follow up personally with the coach saying, "Are you sure? What's going on here?" Because South Florida produces a lot of great football players, especially Miami area too. Letter recommendation comes from the coach. It's surface level, not very good. It's kind of your generic cliched. So I'd say weak overall.
I would call this the sports essay, capital sports essay. We get a lot of these. It can be valuable, but it's definitely nothing that I haven't seen before. There's nothing that really makes it stand out necessarily. The one thing I will say towards the bottom of the essay here is when I look at the students' activities, and I think there's not a lot going on besides football, it is in some ways nice to see that he acknowledges that and is like, I wish that I had done more. And so, despite the fact that we don't have a lot going on in the activities beyond sports, I that might be something where I'm like, maybe he would take advantage of more. I wish that I could see evidence of that or that he could go into that a little bit more in this essay, but at least there's the acknowledgement there is how I'd view it. I'd say good and average for an essay though.
Okay. And then pulling up the cluster report, we see they're not lying in terms of how many students apply here. There are what, 4 RDs alone, 3 early actions, 1 ED who's already been admitted and he paid his deposit, so we're cooking with gas there. You see, this is a school in which we do very well and we don't deny a whole lot of folks, and the ones that deny are very weak academically and or high financial aid ratings. So you see, academic rating is pretty mediocre. SAT is right in the wheelhouse, but no to aid and maybe switching to ED, which can be another factor to consider entirely. So I know there's a whole lot to kind of go through. So if we want to just use this next few minutes to kind of go, I guess, answer any questions you might have when you were looking at these applications, like what were your initial thoughts? Like, was it pretty cut and dry, you thought, based on what we saw, who would be an easy admit, easy deny, a potential committee case? What were your initial thoughts when you've looked at these applications. And feel free to raise your hand and we can kind of go through there since we have a lot of folks on the call. Yes, Faith.
So the most recent one that we just went through, um, he seemed upon first glance a very weak candidate with regard to academics, essay, letter of rec. But you seem to be at the end considering him more than I would have expected. And is that because of football and potential donor and lack of financial aid need? Does that pull it up? Or what was that switch going?
Yeah, I would say kind of all of the above plus the high potential of them switching to ED because thinking about who our hypothetical peer schools are, if they're upstream from us and they apply ED and they have a good endowment, they may have the I guess ability to not automatically take them, which means they'll make that switch like that, right? Plus, I think wasn't a parent an alum, or they have some other ties. So it's a combination of all the factors. It's not just, oh, we're not going to have to give any financial aid dollars, but it's that coupled with, okay, he's doing better grade wise academically. We do see some conscious effort to regret his maybe his choices in high school as an athlete and kind of being a more well-rounded campus community member. So it goes back to holistic as a combination of all these factors, and that'll be one. And I think we can agree that would go to committee, especially because we're not sure about if he's even going to apply ED or not. We'll get that information later on in the process.
Yeah.
That'll be one that we put in the committee minutes as opposed to sending him straight through or just discarding it.
Yeah, I would agree. We'd have a lot of eyes on that one. There would be a lot of conversations, a lot of people talking about it. But definitely, I would agree with Matt in terms of the holistic perspective. For me, the most compelling stuff was the upward trend in the grades and the willingness, or at least acknowledgement of like, I want to do more, right? I'm looking at as a liberal arts candidate, someone who I think is going to take advantage of opportunities on our campus and succeed here. If I think that a student is able to succeed academically and will be a good fit in terms of like community engagement, that's really the most important factors. And then all of the other stuff is like on bonus on top of it. That would be how I would look at it.
And they've also been to campus too. So, and they've actually met with admissions. They didn't just do the classic, oh, I'm meeting the coach and then see you later, won't even say hi. So there's at least some steps being taken to view himself as an actual applicant as opposed to a football player who's applying to the school, if that makes sense. Okay, Beth.
Hi. My question or comment is that I'm finding it really interesting, the cluster report, and I'm trying
Mhm.
to understand the repercussions of that for applicants. I think I understand for the admissions point of view, but even that I'm a little bit murky about because, for example, if you're looking at who was admitted in past years and what their ratings and stats are you also looking at how well they're doing, their GPA at the college or university? Because, like, I'm kind of wondering how it's helpful to know who you admitted in past years. Are you trying to project based on the previous admits using their college GPA or kind of guessing how successful this high school applicant would be as compared to past applicants at the college level? So I'm still trying to kind of make sense of that, how
Mhm.
that context cluster report is used.
I'd say officially no, because we don't really look at what they're doing in college. If I guess maybe the more intrepid folks can like pull up a recent dean's list and just do a control or command F and search the person's last name and see, oh, are they on the list? Okay, they're doing their work there. But I would say it's also bears mentioning that we can still see the actual applications from years past. So as we all know, admissions turnover is very volatile at times. So the person that read the application even last year may not be there anymore. But we can kind of see, okay, does this look right? Does it look a little bit suspect? We can literally go access their application and go through the transcript and see, okay, here's what it actually looks like. So we do have some tools at our disposal with that, but from what I can tell, we don't really look at the college side just because it's hard to do so. We don't have access to that information, but something as, I guess, cursory as searching for dean's list or president's list from the past year and seeing if the person's on there, that could give us some information too.
That makes sense. There's one other question I had about the level of academic rigor.
Mhm.
You're trying, and I noticed that the school counselors are asked to rate the
Yeah.
applicant on that. And I don't know if you look at that or if you're really just looking at almost like a ratio. School offers 10 AP classes, applicant has taken 5. School offers 8 honors classes, applicant has taken 4. Applicants taking 50% of the most rigorous classes, or how you're doing with the whole course rigor, making a judgment or evaluation about that. And of course, then there's the GPA and the actual grades as
Yeah.
well.
We do read that, but to be honest, and it just depends on the school itself. They might just overestimate, and it's understandable, right? You think, oh, they're taking a lot here, but is it actually rigorous? So we have that information, but then we kind of look at ourselves, saying, okay, here's they cap at 2 or 3 each year, and this person's taking 2 or 3. That's the most demanding rigor, period, because they can't literally take any more. So we do have that information, but at the same time, we don't take it as gospel. We use it and make sure, I guess, checking to see if there's any sort of differences between our determinations of the rigor of the applicant. Okay. Gina.
Hi there, thanks. Thank you guys for doing this session. Very helpful. As a previous Pennsylvania College Advising Corps person, go Franklin and Marshall, woohoo, diplomats. Um, 2 questions that are kind of unrelated. One is for the cluster report. I think the last sample student we looked at had also another kind of slew of classmates who are applying in that same
Mhm.
cycle. But you didn't talk about like how you might consider that, right? If there's 10 of them all applying, what does that look like in that same class?
Yeah, and that's, I guess, Hannah, maybe you want to talk about that, but I think that kind of goes into the weeds a little bit, and we know that's not always the case, but we just wanted to kind of use this to show you that admission folks have access to multi-year information. And then when this really happens is when, well, hypothetically speaking, they've reviewed everything and we kind of have the initial decision there and what bin they are. Then that's where the shaping comes into play in terms of, is something missing with the academic rating? Do they have their financial aid documents in? Is there any issues there? Gone to campus, anything like that? So that's when that the shaping really comes to life is with these feeder schools, right? We don't want to kind of say, oh, looking at this one applicant in comparison to the rest of the group just yet after the fact, when we're kind of talking about who's going to come through, who's going to be waitlisted or denied, that goes through the shaping process. And that's usually done by the territory manager and then pushed up to the powers that be when they're doing the shaping models with financial aid and academic ratings and things like that.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate what we've been saying about the cluster report. This is not used maybe as much as we're making it seem like. It's definitely a useful tool, but it's just that it's one additional tool that we're using out of many different tools, and that's what holistic admissions is, right? So both when we're looking at past applicants from the same school or students within, that given year that are all applying from the same school, it can be helpful if I'm like, wow, I am like way out of whack here. What's what's going on. Like things are all mixed up. I'm gonna definitely be having some hard conversations, whatever that may be. But like I said before, how I would kind of look at using a cluster report in a given year, right? All the applicants in a given year is more, what is a college counselor from this school going to have questions about? And is there something that like this student whose academics are not as strong as another student who's being admitted and the other students being waitlisted, am I going to be able to explain in a very concrete way my justification for how we got to where we got? So I think that's how it's more useful using it when I'm talking to a counselor, because in the end, we're just still looking at the individual applicants, right? If I think a student's going to be a good fit, if I think they're going to succeed here, they're going to be admitted regardless of what this cluster report shows for both current and past applicants. So I do just want to be really clear about that.
Awesome.
And then also to consider is that the admit rate you see on the profile, that's everything taken into consideration, right? It's not, here's the admit rate for ED domestic students. Here's the admit rate for RD international. Here's the, it's a number that's drawn from every possible avenue, right? And we all know that those rates can vary widely, right? So when you think about these schools that have low admission rates, that may be the case, but with trends and higher international applicants, and unless the school has 50-50 international and domestic, there's some math there you can kind of do on your own to figure out, okay, what it actually means to apply as a first year domestic student versus a first year international or a transfer, things like that. So that's always something to keep in mind when you see these publicized reports of the admission rate as a whole.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you guys. My second question was not related to that at all. But thinking about how you viewed like the parent occupations, right? In our hypothetical school here, they're need aware, which, right, so you might have a full financial aid report as, form as well. But thinking about our need blind institutions and how, the CEO of Princess Cruises or whatever it was versus, you know, a job that would not indicate that kind of income. Um, Thoughts? What, our job is to help students make the strongest application possible, and that's certainly a detail that students and families don't think about as they're adding. Is that something they should be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think just to think about how kind of quickly review the applications, we just briefly mentioned it, right? And the only one that we actually spent time on was the one that could potentially donate money to the school. The second applicant, it was I think a single mother, right? And it's a mid-need student. We didn't even mention her background at all. So it just depends on the context and where it leads you. So I guess Hannah, for that second applicant, where did you think they would fall within our university?
Say that again. So the second applicant was Jillian.
Jillian, yes, the public school, pretty good. The only thing was kind of messing with her was the down returning grades, but
Yeah.
good test scores,
Yeah.
good there's yeah.
Yeah, I'd see this as an admissible student, honestly. Like maybe a committee if I was like really, had a question mark or there was something else going on in factors here, but I'd say this is a pretty easy admit that like might have additional eyes on it later, just because in the first review, I think a student is admissible doesn't mean that's where they end up staying, but I don't see anything to indicate that the student would not succeed here.
And
And then
we only mentioned that third kid because there was a specific flag from an
yeah.
office that wasn't ours. So had that not even been there, we might have said, okay, parents are wealthy, potential donor, but we didn't have anything to go off of. But now we had something to say, oh, the advancement office is flagging them for potential donors. So that's when something like that might come up as opposed to just say, oh, dad's a lawyer, mom's a doctor. Okay, we see a lot of those applicants, right? And we don't really dwell on it as much as folks might think, especially for even need aware
Yeah.
schools.
I'd say that's even why I described it the way that I did, where I said we have flags that go to other campus partners. That is not about the admissibility of the student. So me saying this is a flag for advancement is not a question about whether the student is more likely to be admitted or not admitted. It's just if he were to be admitted for other factors and he got to the point of enrolling, we now have a list for advancement that we can flag and give to them, and they do that with that what they want to. That's essentially what the purpose of even mentioning that would be in this context.
I think the last question in the chat was asking, do all these applicants go to CBE before admissibility? Yeah, so these schools, unless it just varies, they're not being filtered at the outset. You might have outside readers for those huge universities, and some smaller schools have it, maybe for international applicants, but when you're reviewing it, it's still the first time for a lot of this. So you'll be able to make your initial determination and then pass it on. There is not, from in this hypothetical situation, there is no one flagging apps, removing them from queues. Everything's being read and then they're placed in where they want, and then that's when the conversation happens with the larger group. So I know we've been going for a while now, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.